I just have questions about this because we got a very, we got an experienced one up here today, and not me included, just the clergy. But please have your questions ready. And we're recording, do? Okay, sweet. All right, Father.
Okay, thank you very much. The practice of fasting is a very common one, a very important one for us Orthodox Christians. And I thought the best way to tackle the topic is to use the bit of a roadmap from the recent synod of 2016. So in 2016 there was a synod in Crete, and there were several topics that were covered, and official statements were put out in terms of the teaching of the Orthodox Church on those topics. One of them was fasting. And I won't read the text to you, but what I will do is summarise the points, and there are a few beautiful little gems that describe and give us an idea of why fasting is so valuable to us Orthodox Christians. Now, as I go along, if there's something that doesn't make sense, please feel free to put up your hand and interrupt and ask me, could you explain that, or, but otherwise the questions can be at the end, but more than happy to field questions from during the presentation. All right, let's talk about fasting as a definition. So nistia, the Greek word, is the word for abstinence, to abstain from something, to say no to something. And in English, fasting has to do with fastening, like fastening a seatbelt, right? There's a level of self-control and restraint that we place on ourselves. And this is important to say, that we place it on ourselves. Because if we were to think that fasting is something that is placed on us by the church or my grandmother, it doesn't work that way. You need to consider fasting as a challenge that you place upon yourself. If it's external, you're not going to end up doing any fasting. If it's, I'm going to try that, I'm going to challenge myself, I can do this, I understand its benefits, and we'll cover some of the ground today, then you will actually be inspired to make the attempt. So I had my 8-year-old just the other day pretty much tell me, okay, understood from attending church that we just had Carnival Sunday, and that was the last day of meat eating until Easter. The 8-year-old understood that. And so upon seeing me in the last couple of days, at breakfast, not going for the ham, not going for the bacon, he wanted to do the same. And so the question of at what point do we challenge ourselves to fast? Well, as a priest, I always encourage, it's an adult thing really. You want adults and young adults to challenge themselves to do fasting. But as Father Athanasios and Bishop Christodoulos could attest, that only a couple of decades ago, is that how old you are, young you are? A few more decades ago, we were fasting from 7 years old, 6 years old with the family. So the family fasted, and we as children went with that. We didn't ask for meat, just whatever was on the table we ate. So it's perfectly achievable for kids too, but it's even more achievable if the person who is undertaking the fasting understands what they're doing. And that comes at about 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. Okay? And obviously it would not be an imposition on their health, but to the extent that they can, and we'll make that point today. All right, so as a definition, we spoke about fasting as being a discipline. It's an important word, discipline. As young people, we often are still learning what discipline is. Or maybe we had discipline when we were in high school, and then when we're young adults, we drop off a bit, and then we realise that, well, actually, if I maintain discipline in life, it's all gain, it's all win. Fasting is not an end in itself. but a means to another goal. We don't fast because fasting. We fast because we want to get somewhere. And that somewhere is spiritual virtues and spiritual behaviors such as vigilance, being vigilant. What, just with food? No, you're vigilant on a lot of things, but you train yourself to be vigilant with the food and you apply the lessons of vigilance to other behaviors and other actions and other scenarios in life. So if you're vigilant, you can struggle. You have endurance in a struggle, in an agona. This is important. How many examples in life do we have where life gives us a curveball, gives us drama, gives us trouble, and the only way to get through it is endurance, to endure and be strong. Well, you can't endure unless you've made yourself strong. You can't endure unless you've learned to do without certain things. And the practice arena is food. So easy. Practice on the food, apply on everything else. We have a beautiful hymn that we shall be chanting in a week or two, part of the Triodion, that praises fasting as grace that is full of light, an invincible weapon, the beginning of spiritual struggle, the perfect path of virtues, the nourishment for the soul, the source of all wisdom. How does that stack up? Well, the answer is that when you remove food from being the be-all and end-all and you place your mind into desiring spiritual nourishment, that is the beginning of wisdom. Life imperishable, an imitation of the angelic life. So there is gain to be gained after death, and the mother of all good things and virtues. Well, that's a pretty strong statement about the value and benefit of fasting. Now, I read that straight out of the statement on fasting from the Synod of Crete in 2016. And I encourage all of you to, if you want to read it a little bit more deeply, all you have to do is Google official documents, Holy and Great Synod of Crete 2016. And all the different documents will come up, including this one. Any questions thus far? Okay, the next point that needs to be made is, so where is fasting in the Bible? Because what you get from many non-traditional Christian groups, many Protestant groups, is fasting. Why? What for? The Catholics have fasting, but they've watered it down to the extent where, I was just reading up in the afternoon, where we will not say, we will reject meat, we Orthodox reject meat for 40 days before Easter entirely, plus Holy Week, so another 6 or 7 days. It's about 46, 47, 48 days of no meat. The Catholics are currently down to, don't eat meat on the Fridays of Lent. They used to do what we do. But they've watered it down to the point that you can eat meat any day of Lent, just not the Fridays. If we're talking about discipline, self-control, challenge, and all these benefits in terms of vigilance and endurance, that's like saying, I want to do one push-up and that's enough. No, if you want to be fit and you want to achieve a certain goal in terms of fitness, the same way you do for the physical, external, from an external point of view of the body, likewise, you can challenge yourself in a spiritual way. Challenge yourself. You can do it. It's entirely doable. Our grandmothers, or our great-grandmothers, as the case may be, in the villages where they came from, they didn't have what we have. They didn't have fridges. It was normal for them not to eat meat for long stretches. And it was harder for them, but they did it. It's easier for us to make choices and not be in desperation We have what we need. We have enough. We have plenty. We have the facility of the technology of fridges and so on. It's easier for us to do the fasting. So previous generations can teach us a lesson. Let's move on to the argument of why fasting, why even bother, because there's a whole heap of Protestants who will say, look at these customs the Orthodox Christians have. They're customs that, overtake their focus. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't overtake our focus, it gives us focus. And if there's one thing the Protestants are going to listen to, it's what's in the Bible. What's in Scripture? Is there a scriptural basis for fasting? And the answer that the Synod of Crete gives is, it gives all the quotes. There's fasting in the Old Testament, there's fasting in the New Testament. Jesus Christ himself fasted. Jesus Christ himself accepted that fasting is something everyone did. And is also explained in the letters of the apostles as a means of abstinence, achieving repentance and spiritual growth. So it's in there. It's in the Bible. I can give you the quotes if you wanted to look up the exact references. And each generation of Christians has fasting as a means to spiritually grow. Look at the apostles, look at the apostolic didachie, the apostolic teaching. The idea of fasting on every Wednesday and Friday of the year is there from the first century after Christianity. So within 100 years of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, we have clear writings that describe the benefit of fasting, and that the early Christians of the 150 AD, were fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays and the 40 days before Lent, before Easter. So Lent. They're the first three big fasts that are attested to in the historical record. And with the generation that came through further down the track, a few other fasting periods were also added to the challenge and the list. The other example of fasting we can compare to is the Muslim fasting of Ramadan. So the Muslims eat whatever they want throughout the year. There's no abstinence whatsoever throughout the year. But in Ramadan, for 30 days, they will from sunrise to sunset not eat anything. But that means that before sunset and after sunset, they can eat whatever they want. We can do that. That's a walk in the park. It's so easy to do that. If you're going to pig out in the morning before you start the sunset, and you have enough in your stomach to, struggle by the afternoon, and then pack it in after sunset, it's easy. Absolutely easy. And so the challenge is to the Muslims. You say, okay, you eat meat every single day in Ramadan. Show me that you cannot eat meat for 48 days. It's a different type of fast. It is a challenge for them too, sure. And it's even harder in the Middle East where it's hot and so on. But you can each take your own conclusions in terms of which is more of a challenge or more of a discipline or more of a benefit ultimately. Let's skip a few bits and pieces. All right, so we agree that fasting is something that is a good thing and that we should be challenging ourselves to do. There is also an apostolic teaching which says, but do what you can do as well. This is important because not everyone can take on the challenge. All of you guys can, but not everyone can. If someone is unwell or sick or is ill, it is understandable that you need not fast as strictly or need not challenge yourself to that degree. You need to give consideration to where you're at. Are you ill? Are you unwell? Do you have a condition that does not allow you to fast? What advice do you have from your doctor? Are you traveling? Are you doing military service? We'll see a few of the teachings from the Synod of Crete towards the end of the thing. So the apostles themselves say, encourage us to take up the challenge. But if you are not able, do what you are able. And concerning meat, or meat eating, bear that which you are able to do. There's flexibility there, and each of us has a responsibility to take on fasting responsibly, not blindly. And that means knowing what we can and cannot do. There was one time this mother came up to me, actually it was a phone call, and distressed. And the thing was like this: Father, you've got to talk to my son. It's really bad. Yeah, I've had phone calls like that a million times, as has Father Athanasios and Bishop Christodoros. You've got to talk to my son, it's really bad. And I'm thinking, okay, what is it? Drugs? What is it? Trying to work out what the problem is. Okay, what's the problem? He's decided to fast for 40 days. I said, what's the problem with that? She said, he's going to die. I said, he's not going to die. He's a young bloke, he's decided to challenge, let him try it. He's trying discipline here, and you're worried about that. I commend him. I think you should join him. Let's keep going. A lovely quote from Saint Vasilios the Great in his essay on fasting. Listen to this. A true fast is one that is set against evil. Evil is an umbrella term for anything bad or harmful. A true fast is self-control of the tongue, for example. So fasting is not just food, he's saying. And it goes back to the point I made about it being applicable in so many other aspects of life. So, self-control of the tongue. It is the checking of anger. Check anger. Contain anger. Rub it out. Separation from things like lusts, evil speaking, lies, and false oaths. Self-denial from these things is a true fast. Fasting from these negative things is good. That's the teaching of the church. And during Lent that we will enter now, we're going to get this theme coming through. If you're going to fast from food, fast also from certain behaviours. So that was point 3 on the statement from the Synod of Crete. Let's go to point 4. The idea that fasting is co-suffering with Christ. And if you co-suffer, you also co-rise. If you challenge yourself and achieve 40 days of no meat eating, it's going to have a certain effect on you. It's going to have effect on your body, number one, but also on your mind and soul. And for those of us who do this on an annual basis, we can tell you how light we feel, not only in terms of kilos, but in terms of clarity of thought and what we want in life and what we don't want in life. Our whole outlook changes. And so that's what we mean by co-rising or acquiring new life. It changes you for the better and resurrects you into better life. Obviously, both in this world, but also in preparation for the next. Point number 5, growth and maturity. This is important because fasting should be done in a graded way. If you've never fasted before, it's going to be a greater challenge to start. Actually, we're starting on Monday. The Monday coming is Clean Monday, day 1 of 40 days. If you've never done this before, it's going to be harder for you. If you can challenge yourself, fantastic. But know that you may not be able to fulfill it. And that there's a place for working up to it. Some of us will be able to do it. Some of us are very strong in mind, and that's all you need to, impose that on the body. Others of us would need to say, okay, I've never done 40 days. Let me try doing the first week, the Wednesdays and Fridays of the other weeks of Lent, and then Holy Week. That's one way of grading yourself, making yourself achieve what you feel you can achieve. Now, this is important because if we think of the word askesis in the Orthodox tradition, askesis is the Greek word for exercise. We consider spiritual growth as askesis, as exercise, something that is done with steps. There are fanatics out there on the internet who demand that you do everything as is, black and white. They don't understand grades. They don't understand steps. They don't understand getting there. They think people can just do that. The answer here is we want people to achieve the bar and achieve the standard, but we also know how they can get there. It just doesn't happen with a click of a finger. It takes will of mind and preparation and training of body to achieve that. Point number 6, that there are prescribed fasting days and periods throughout the year that relate to liturgical commemorations of the year. That's nice because, as with Lent, it's preparation for Easter. Wednesdays and Fridays, why was it not Mondays and, Thursdays? Wednesday because it was the day of Jesus when he was betrayed, and Friday was the day he was crucified. So there's a remembrance of why Wednesday and why Friday. Why the exaltation of the cross? Well, we remember the sacrifice of the cross, September 14. Why fast for 2 weeks before the Dormition of the Virgin Mary on the 15th of August? Well, that's a preparation for that feast and festival. These fasts are there in order to put milestones through the year. But there are also other times we fast. There are times that you might choose personally to fast. Do you understand this? So there are the prescribed fasts through the year. Trust me, there's enough fasting there. But if you want to challenge yourself beyond black belt level and go to master level, you can do that. No one is stopping you. And some people fast more than what the church prescribes, like our grandmothers, some of our grandmothers. That's not a bad thing. If you want to do that, you can do that and challenge yourself. The other reason there might be fasting placed in the year beyond the commemorations is as a pastoral thing. Your spiritual father, your spiritual guide might use fasting as a tool to help you grow. So that can happen too. Point number 7, the concept of flexibility and economia. This is extremely important. We've already mentioned that the apostles had economia, had flexibility. Do what you are able to do. That's a good rule in itself. And so there are situations and scenarios in life where the church is not going to say, you didn't fast in this scenario. What's wrong with you? There's no judgment in that regard. Why? Because we've already established through the teaching I've touched upon that fasting is your choice. The church gives you a pattern. It gives you a model. It gives you a training regime. It gives you possible exercises. It gives you standards and bars to be met. But it's actually your choice. And to the extent that you will do the fasting. Let's have a look at this. The church has established with pastoral discernment. How important is the word discernment? Being able to tell the difference. Discernment. Boundaries of philanthropic dispensation. Ekonomia in Greek. Ekonomia. Yes, it sounds like economy. Ekonomia is the law of the home. It's nothing to do with financials. The law of the home is, will you tell me what the law of the home is? Does mum and dad have laws stuck on the wall? Or is it a, let's see how we go, and as you go along, let's talk about it? It's not a legalistic system at home. It's a family. And a family talks to you. A family sets an example. Mum and dad obviously should fast first and set the example. How do you expect kids to fast if mum and dad aren't fasting, right? So that's how it works. That's economia. The law of the home is loving, coming from love and trying to achieve something together. That's economia. The church is also a family and has its economia, its flexibility, its dispensation and discernment. Here are a few examples. The church has considered physical infirmity, extreme necessity, and difficult times where the application of the principle of ecclesiastical economia should be applied through the responsible discernment and pastoral care of the body of bishops in the local churches. And it gives us a few more examples. Therefore, in point 8, with regard to those who find it difficult to observe the prevailing guidelines for fasting, whether for personal reasons such as illness, military service, conditions of work, etc., or other general reasons, particular existing conditions in certain regions with regard to climate, as well as socio-economic circumstances, for example, inability to find Lenten foods, it is left to the discretion of the local Orthodox churches to determine how to exercise philanthropic economia and empathy, relieving in these special cases the burden of the Holy Fast. Okay, one example that springs to mind in terms of history is the Eskimos. So when the Eskimos became Orthodox Christian in the 1700s, from the Russian Orthodox, they were taught fasting, that we do fasting. Okay, how is an Eskimo supposed to fast when all they have in their diet is seal meat? Vegetables don't grow up there, at least most of the season. There were periods in the year, whole months on end during the year, where all they could possibly eat was seal meat. So what was the solution that the Russian Orthodox Church came up with in this case specifically? Well, okay, we're not going to starve to death, but we still want you to fast because it's X, Y, and Z benefit. Okay, well, instead of eating what you normally eat in a meal, let's talk about quantity as opposed to meat versus vegetables. You're still going to eat meat, but eat less meat. That's still fasting. That's an example of flexibility and economia under the circumstances. That was in the 1700s. These days, neither the Eskimos, nor you, nor I have the excuse of saying, I don't have Lenten foods. I don't have vegan or vegetable foods. We have plenty of everything. We even have vegan foods, vegetable-based foods that taste exactly like meat. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's so easy for us these days, so that's not applicable to us. But the illness is a good example. I often, and the fathers could attest, you go to the hospitals and we say to the old lady, I'm here to give you communion. And they're like, oh, but I haven't fasted. They're coming from a good place. They take their communion seriously. And we always have to explain to them, but the church dispenses, gives you flexibility in when you're ill, when you're unwell. You have to eat in order to be better and get better. For the oldies, we have to remind them that. For you guys, it's the opposite. We're trying to encourage you to fast, okay? And hopefully you can get to where the oldies are, where you have that love for, doing the right thing in terms of fasting and the other practices that we have. The military service one is a good example because if you're doing military service, you don't get to choose. You're going to eat what they're going to give you, yeah? So that's understandable. You don't want people to be in military service and have, I can't eat, I'll starve. These are unthinkable things. So there are scenarios where a person needs to make a choice. Conditions of work, same story there. Tradies among us, there's some really heavy-going occupations in the building industry, for example, where you might go one day with vegetables. Good luck convincing the bricklayer to do, not eat meat on a certain day. Their body requires that food in order to achieve their job. That's one example I can think of. Any other questions there? Before I wrap up with, yeah?
Just a quick one, you mentioned with the substitutes that taste like meat. How does that sit with the church? Is that sort of like, is it seen as a way of sort of like a backdoor, because you're replicating the taste of meat, are you really fasting? Like, how is that seen by the church?
The question for the benefit of the recording is that we have vegan substitutes for meat these days, and does the church consider it a cop-out? Is it the same as eating meat? It's not the same as eating meat. Eating meat is, we want to challenge our people not to eat meat. Okay, so they've gone for vegan bacon rashers, like they exist. Well, look, it's the next level down. It's still the enjoyment of meat. It is still the luxury of tasting the same and feeling the same. So if you want to be true to the principle, you will also avoid the fake meat. But if you cannot do that, you're still achieving something by saying no to real meat. It's still an achievement. Is it the best achievement? No, you can do better. But in terms of getting there, it's one of the steps. Okay, same with vegan cheese and all that. Answer your question? Okay, so it's not a black and white question. It's a matter of how do we use even that to our benefit. For someone who's never fasted, that might be their first step to actually fasting properly. So go for it. Okay, point 8 speaks about no compulsion. So it's good that we've come to that point. The quote that the Synod of Crete uses is from St. John of Damascus on his essay on the Holy Fast, homily number 3. Listen to this, and this is for all the fanatics out there who think that everyone must do this. It's the law of the Orthodox Church. That's being a Pharisee. That's turning the canons of the Church into what the Pharisees had in terms of a law, that our relationship with God is a law. No, the canons are guidelines. And listen to St. John of Damascus, who will do the teaching for me. It is good to fast, but may the one who fasts not look at the one who does not fast and blame them. In such matters, you must neither legislate, nor use force, nor compel the flock entrusted to you. Compel the flock entrusted. You must do this. St. John says, do not force things. Instead, you must use persuasion, gentleness, and a word seasoned with salt. What a beautiful analogy. And that's a good sort of approach. It tells you, persuade of the benefit of fasting, you'll achieve more than telling people, this is the law, this is what you must do. Good luck convincing anyone to do fasting that way. Point number 9, it's the last point from the Synod of Crete in 2016, and has to do with what to do prior to communion. And basically it explains that there is fasting prior to communion. You cannot turn up to communion on a full stomach. And so the general rule is that you should be going to communion with an empty stomach. 98% of the time, that's going to be waking up in the morning, going to church without having breakfast, and having communion. 98% of the time, that's what it looks like. Occasionally, like in Lent, there are going to be some nighttime services with communion. pre-sanctified liturgy and some other Vespers liturgies in the night. The Easter Vigil, 2:30 a.m. How do you even abstain from food prior to that communion? And the answer is, the rule is the empty stomach rule, as opposed to the wake up rule. Have you heard of the wake up rule? If you want to commune, don't eat anything since waking up. Well, that's fine if communion's at 10 a.m., but how are you going to manage to get to 6 p.m., 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. on Easter? It doesn't work that way. But the rule is empty stomach. You have to have an empty stomach. If you combine it with a bit of sleep, that's also good. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from the councils themselves, including Tertullian, an ancient writer, who speaks about communion being received before any other food enters the stomach. Times, church forbids. Okay, and one last point I want to make is that there are times that the church forbids fasting. There are times the church says you should not be fasting on these days. Why? Because they are feast days. Why are they called feast days? Because we're celebrating, we're feasting. It's a celebration. We're enjoying ourselves. Fasting is the opposite of enjoyment. Fasting is discipline. So I've created this calendar here for my parishioners, my Fast and Furious fasting calendar. Right, so what I've got there is a colour-coded list of the whole year, telling you exactly what the church prescribes in terms of fasting. What you will notice throughout the year is that there are whole weeks where the church says, no fasting, please. Between Christmas and Epiphany, between Easter and the whole week after Easter, from Pentecost to All Saints' Day. Is that right? You're not supposed to be fasting. So there are moments where there's no fasting. Why? Because feasting has its place too. In our case, in the week that just passed, we're supposed to be feasting. Why? So we'll stock up. We're about to do 40 days with no meat. You should have stocked up by now. Right. If you want one, let me know. That's another question, Your Grace. Do my parishioners follow this calendar? This is a challenge to my parishioners. And I'll put a magnet on it so I can put it on their fridge too. Any other questions?
Does the church have a standardized approach to fasting the day before communion?
Say that again.
Does the church have a standardized approach to fasting before communion?
Yeah. Does the church have a standardized procedure before communion?
Like the day before? Like some people
For the day before, no. It is, you wake, you go to church, you commune on an empty stomach. If it's an evening service, an empty stomach means you have breakfast in the morning. If you can challenge yourself to skip lunch, great. If you can't, have lunch, and you've got 6 hours for that stomach to empty. And scientifically speaking, it takes 4 or 6 hours for the stomach to empty, if you want to put a number on it. So in terms of the day before communion, that doesn't apply, because there are days that the church says you should be eating meat on Easter. Yes? What if your name is George, and on the Monday after Easter it's St. George celebration, and you want to go to communion, you want to go to church on St. George's Day? What does the church expect you to do? It expects you to eat meat on Easter Day and come and commune the next morning. That's how it works. So if you're following all the fasts of the church, you can be technically eating meat the day before and communing the next day. The practice of a day of nothing is because people don't follow this. So if you're not following this, yes, a day before at least is important. But that's not even part of the church's rules. But it's something people do out of their own personal choice, and it has become a custom here and there. Any other questions?
So not eating meat is a challenge. If you are a vegan, what sort of challenges do you?
Good question. What if you're a vegan? You're already not eating any meat. That's a good question. And first and foremost, I commend people who are vegans. I commend people who are vegans. Now, why? Because they have said no to meat altogether forever. They're already disciplined. They're already holding back. So the point of, I hope and look, let me make a clarification though. If veganism is an ideology in your life, the church doesn't support you on that. If veganism is a tool, discipline, I'm growing, I'm using it as another way of achieving spiritual aims, you've converged the two. Fantastic. Does that answer your question? Oh, but how are you going to do the 40-day fast? The answer is, can you, in terms of quantity, let's use the Eskimo example once again, if you only eat vegan, less vegan. Yeah, less vegan. That'll work. I know a lot of people who have, look, the monks never eat meat ever again. We eat meat 70 days a year if you follow this strictly. The monks don't ever eat meat again. Questions? Only 70 days of meat eating if you follow this. Trust me, there's plenty of meat. If you look at the Mediterranean diet, you should be eating, if you're following the Mediterranean diet, you should be eating meat, red meat, twice a month. Fish once a week, white meat, including chicken, once a week, and the red meat is like only special occasions. The rest should already be plant-based. That's the You want to live to 100? That's the formula. Sorry, guys. That's the formula. You can't be eating red meat. Forget religion now. Forget the Orthodox practice. Forget the Orthodox custom. Purely on its benefits, the Mediterranean diet, which allows for very minimal red meat, is the premium diet. Year after year, that's the best diet, according to science. Full stop. Next. So yes, that's not gyros every night. You will die early. Do I have to tell you that?
There was a certain threat not that long ago about foot and mouth disease threatening the meat industry. If something was in the future, if something like that in the future was to ever happen, like some sort of foot and mouth disease that was to threaten the livestock of many countries, if I started thinking like that, and like how would my attitude be if I started thinking, well, it's best not to eat meat at all because there's a potential contamination or there's a chance that I might get sick.
So the question for the benefit of the recording is, if in an outbreak of, let's say, foot and mouth disease for the beef industry, you're saying that whether there's such an outbreak, you want to refuse meat eating altogether? What's wrong with that? Nothing wrong with that.
Well, I'm just saying maybe the reason could be, like you might start your attitude towards fasting might change because of that.
It might help you do better fasting.
You may not be fasting necessarily because of spiritual growth, but because you're more scared that you might get sick.
Oh, you're fasting for the wrong reasons. I see what you're saying. Look, it's still something. Once again, not black and white. And look, to be honest, now that it's come up to my head, in my memory, there is a canon that says that if you're refusing to eat meat because you are revolted by meat, that's a problem. Have you come across that canon? No. Yeah. We want our people to refuse meat as a discipline, not because they're revolted by meat. This is interesting. It's a question, a deep sort of philosophical question. But let's use another example. We are currently going through avian flu. So the chicken stocks in all of the world are are doing this. Now, you might say, I don't want to eat any chicken meat because I might catch avian flu. Yeah, that's a logical fear. Don't eat chicken. You've got 40 days break.
And I'm not sure what the daily adult intake is at the moment, 2,800 kilojoules, whatever how many kilojoules it is. If you're finding substitute, if you're finding fasting foods that can substitute that 2,800 kilojoules or whatever it is that still like fasting? Like, is that still?
If you're finding the same amount of kilojoules or protein or other nutrients that you would otherwise have had by eating meat, by eating plant-based food, is that the same thing as eating meat or chicken?
I don't know, is that the same fasting discipline? Is that the same?
It's still a discipline. We want you to have the nutrients. This is not the question. We want people to not die. Fasting is not for you to become, sick. Fasting is for you to become strong. So if you can substitute the meat, it's the luxury that's the problem. The luxury of the meat, the nice taste that we're challenging ourselves to say no to. So if we can get those nutrients from X, Y, and Z, we should be. And not worry about, is this a cop-out? I'm getting the same nutrients as I would have. It's not about the nutrients. We want you to have nutrients. We want you to have food. We're trying to get you to apply discipline to yourself and to remove the enjoyment of the eating. Okay, and that goes back to the fake bacon question. There's still enjoyment in that. I recently had it was a burger at Bondi Junction. I serve at Bondi Junction. So my church, Rose Bay, I cover Bondi Beach, Bondi Junction, all that area. And they had this vegan burger. I had my son with me that day, we were blessing houses. And I thought, I've got to get a burger into it. And it's like, vegan burger, you've got to taste this, unbelievable. It tasted exactly the same, not only in terms of taste, but in texture as well, with the actual meat. Yeah, it was interesting.
Way of getting discipline, gaining strength. So I ask from your experience, how that also potentially impacts your prayer life. So whether it deepens it during Lent, whether it changes it in any way, how links to prayer.
The question for the benefit of the recording is, how does fasting influence your prayer life? Is that a good summary of your question? And the answer is, it absolutely does. It makes you pray more. It challenges you to read more. When you're eating meat, let me think of another story. There was a Jewish couple, because out there's a lot of Jews, as you know, and well-meaning, a husband and a wife, they started coming to the church at Rose Bay. And they were exploring, they were trying out the fasting. And the first thing this Jewish guy told me, after doing the fasting properly, they did it properly. He said, after the 40 days, what I wanted 40 days ago from life, what enjoyments, what luxuries, what desires I had, out the window. I wanted the opposite. I wanted prayer life. I wanted more reading. I wanted to just be in the light of God. So fasting became the means or the tool to other benefits, and that's exactly what we're teaching here. Hope that answers your question.
What about like oils? Because I know sometimes when we buy foods, if we're really trying to do the fast, we're trying to avoid, some people have like, vegetable oil, olive oil, and stuff like that. What does the church think about that?
Oil,
Yeah.
the whole philosophy of oil in the fasting. Okay. All right. So there are days that oil is a question. Oil is a question once again because of what it does to the food in a good way, in a luxury way. in a nice tasting way. Okay, so a salad on its own, a salad with olive oil, better than a meat pie. Yeah? No? Okay, sorry. For me it's better than a meat pie. So, with olive oil makes nice food. Let's go potatoes. Boiled potatoes versus chips, fried potatoes. Big difference. It's a luxury. It's nice. It's enjoyable. So there are days where, of course, we eat food with oil. That means dressing and frying. And there are days that the church says strict, and it's only like a dozen days in the year, fully strict. Fully strict, not even oil. Okay. There's a purpose for that. To challenge us to that point, to say that even oil is something we should say no to. Same goes with alcohol and wine. There are days we shouldn't be consuming alcohol. It's part of this. Answer your question. It's good?
Father, what happens when we're at someone's house and they've invited us for dinner and without them realizing they give you a non-fasting food?
Yeah, that's a common scenario. So the question from Father Athanasios was, the scenario we get often is that you turn up to someone's house and outside of Lent, in an unsuspecting time, it's a Wednesday, let's say, I'm fasting. But they brought out meat pies. Because they happen not to fast, it's not in their regime, or their weekly cooking regime, whatever, fair enough. You can't blame the people, number one. But number two, what do you do? That's your question. What do you do? You have two options. You can either politely say, thank you very much, this looks lovely, but I'm fasting today. Or it depends on their soul. Because we just had a passage we read on Sunday, Apostle Paul teaching us about what to do with eating. And that it's more important to think about what's going on in that person's head and soul than what's on the plate. So if in his or her head you saying no is an offence because they have opened their house to accept you in terms of hospitality, that's a scandal in their head. They're failing, okay. They're not mature enough to accept what you're doing, and they'll get offended. You have the option to weigh that up with your conscience. So you might eat just so that you don't upset that person. There is a reason that you will eat that meat. Let's eat less meat. So if they gave you let's go a Greek recipe here, imam baldi, nice minced meat in it, they've given it to you. Eat half of it. You're still abstaining. You're still maintaining discipline to an extent, and you have given that person. You have removed the possibility of that person being upset with you. The priest came and didn't even eat my food. Okay.
It's interesting. I was thinking, you talked about hitting the mark up here, like if you're fasting, when you're doing everything, you're hitting the mark up here for not eating meat. Oh, sorry. So you talked about not eating meat and fasting is like hitting the mark up here for everyone. But what happens if there's maybe a person that, if they don't eat a certain way or they don't eat meat, or if they're hungry, they have more of a fuse to snap or get angry at someone.
If they don't eat?
If they're not eating meat and they're abstaining and they're fasting and they have more of a tendency to snap, is it more humble for them to say, okay, I understand that maybe today I've got a short fuse? Is it a more humble thing not to fast, to keep the peace and the love between the other people around them, or else try and fast and think they're the hero and then hurt someone that's around them.
Okay, so you're saying that there would be a scenario where someone fasting gives them a short fuse?
Yeah, it could. They could
They're
be angry. They could be
Angry people.
Or it could be many situations in their life that can cause them to get upset. Is it
Okay.
better for them to have their strength?
Okay. So I would think that we've explained this evening that fasting is not just the food. That when we're fasting, if we're only fasting from food and not applying that to behaviours, then we will have short fuses still. And we will still be hangry. And we will still, right. So we're not doing the fasting properly. You need to understand that the fasting needs to be applied not only to the food but to behaviours. So my thought is that fasting is supposed to make you calmer. You know what I mean? I would think that's the case. And more patient, not the opposite. And if the opposite is happening and you're more angry when you're fasting, you're not fasting properly because you're only fasting from food. You've got to apply it to everything else. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sort of.
Good enough? Good enough?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've got a good example where you're talking about my father. I think I mentioned this story here before, once at Koi. When I started going to church, I was really strict about this the fasting stuff and the plan. I didn't want oil in the foods on Wednesdays and Fridays, which I think is the custom sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. And, you know, I was working and stuff as well, and I still didn't want the oil in my food. And I remember my yaya once, I was living with her at the time, she made lentil soup, fuck yes, and she put oil in the soup. And I got angry, you know. I kind of snapped at her, like Father was saying, you know. I snapped, I lost my temper. And it didn't feel good, you know, I felt terrible. My yaya looked sad, you know, her face was sad. I said, why'd you put the oil in the food? It's Wednesday. Yeah, there's no oil today. I said, I'm trying to fast, I'm trying to do these things you used to tell me about since I was a kid. Now I'm doing it, and look, when you're trying to sabotage me or something. But this is how I was thinking, and I snapped. Then I went to confession, I said it, because I felt terrible. And my father confessor said, he said, it would have been better for you to just eat it and just tell your yaya how nice it was, how nice it tasted with the oil, and how much you love her. And he goes, that's what you should have done. Just say, wow, this is delicious, this food, yaya. I love you so much. You know, and quell it with love instead of becoming a fanatic about it. And yeah, and in a way he told me as well, it's better to have a steak and then have love in your heart than to fast and have hate in your heart. I don't know. I think that's what reminded me of Father when you asked that.
I was reading a story once, a spiritual father, someone went for confession and this guy was married with young kids, and he goes to spiritual father that my wife, he thought it was intentionally done, but he said to spiritual father that my wife refuses to do fasting food at home. So whenever I go home, all the food is not fasting, and they would have arguments about it. And the spiritual father said to him, whatever your wife makes, you'll be eating from now on. So, you know, his wife on the Tedati, she made a meat dish and he ate it and he complimented her how nice it was. She was looking at him. Then another day was a Friday or something. She made another meat dish. He ate it. He complimented her. Eventually, she realized that. So she started making this dish fasting foods. So I think it's what you said, Father, that we need discernment with fasting, and not to think that because we're fasting we're something special. And to share a story, once we visited with Presbytera her yaya. She lived in Wollongong, and it was during anesthesia, and she had a meat dish. She didn't have anything else. She had a meat dish. I'm looking at her, I'm like, what do I do now? She's like, oh, it's up to you. I go, all right, I'll eat it. So I'm eating it, and the grandmother looks at me, she smiles, and she goes, I'm sorry, I know it's a fasting day today, Father, but I'm like, see, I told you I shouldn't have had it.
You failed the test.
Yeah? I found the test. No, she loved me.
Another thing, it's important that we know our limits as well, because if we don't understand our limits, we can easily go overboard. And I can testify to that. I fasted too much at one point where I lost like 12 kilos, and things just get out of hand. You just go backwards instead of making any progress. So it's important to know your limits. And another thing, you guys have to understand why you guys are fasting. It has to be a personal thing. I mean, you're not just going to leave here and start fasting, you know, like if you don't find your love for Christ, which is the person that you're sacrificing everything for, the person that died for us, the person that got nails put in himself on the cross for us so we could live an eternal life. You guys have to find that love, or else the fasting, the prayer, and everything else that comes with it, it's just going to be like one big burden, because it's not just the fasting. You're stopping things that you might like, going out, drinking. It might affect the boys at the gym. I know this is a conflict that I had as well. Like, I didn't want to lose gains, so I'm not going to fast. You know what I mean? And that's because I was feeling that missing part of myself with going to the gym. And once you find that love and you like, okay, I love Christ now, I want to do more, he starts to feel that missing bit, and then it becomes easier to let go of these other things. Not completely, but it becomes a bit easier to balance these things. Because you're fasting, you're thinking like, oh, like, this is making me angry, or I just want to go to the gym. If your mind is there, you're going to make yourself suffer. So it's better to take baby steps and to try and find your love for Christ with prayer, and then with the guidance of the spiritual father, slowly you guys can work your way into fasting, because it needs to be an expression of love. Everything we do is an expression of love for Christ. It's not, I'm doing it because I've got the strength. We've got nothing. If God cuts our legs today, we're not going to be able to walk. So it's important to understand that Christ gives us the strength to keep moving forward, and the more love we show, the more strength He'll give us, and eventually we'll be able to do the fast. So just have that in mind.
Straight after Christ's baptism, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, into the desert, to fast for 40 days. Would we say as Orthodox Christians that it was his divine nature that sustained him throughout that period, or was this a full human effort and struggle?
So the question is, with Jesus fasting for 40 days himself, and how did he manage to do that fast? Well, the question is, we don't know. Is fasting defined in this case as 0, 0, 0?
Well, one of the Gospels indicates that he didn't eat or drink anything.
Yeah. Look, we would say that his divine nature obviously, sustained him. But by the same token, he fully participated in our human nature. When he was fasting for 40 days, was he still hungry? He was still, that was the whole idea. He went out there and challenged himself as a human. Now, is that humanly possible, 40 days with 0 food, 0 water? It's not humanly possible. And so, but we don't know, was he drinking water? If he was drinking water from the creeks, then that's doable. Why is this important? Because we want Jesus to be our model. And we sometimes feel that, well, because he was divine, is not exactly the same. And we look to the saints and other holy people to get our example. But it's important to remember that would Jesus have, cheated by allowing his divine nature to sustain him? I think no. I think he allowed the human nature to be tested, the human nature to be pushed to the edge. He was pushed so much to the edge that the devil appeared in front of him and gave him the 3 temptations, which it's a talk on its own. One of them was, turn these rocks into bread. He could have, chose not to. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word which comes out of God's mouth. Yeah, I think that's a good message. But thanks for bringing that up.
I think it's important that we understand that Jesus was human as well, so he felt the need to eat, to sleep, to participate in all of the human faculties, In the church language, we call it avyavli tapasi. So everything that, as a human, he had needs. Obviously, so I think the 40 days, I have no issues with Jesus drinking water, or I don't think, like, if we take it literally, like I was reading a story on Facebook a few days ago that there was this Protestant pastor that went to practice the 40 days Nistia fasting that Jesus had done, and he died, I think, halfway in the fast, because you can't take things literally. Like, for example, you read the story of Saint Gerasimos of Sarov, who knelt every night for 1,000 days. Obviously, he would have had breaks. Like, it was God's grace helping him, but we need to use logic. So Jesus ate with his friends. He drank water. He would satisfy his human needs, go to the toilet, all that. Like, it's nothing. We shouldn't be scared to accept these facts.
He was on his own. I don't think anyone was actually witnessing if he was drinking from the crease or not. But one of the Gospels clearly indicates that he didn't eat or drink anything before he died. I'm just trying to work out if it's a human effort on its own.
But even if he did, is that a problem? Even if he did drink water?
That's not my problem. I'm just trying to work out, between the divine and the human nature, where this all comes into play.
It's a question. Theologumen.
Yeah.
A question for another philosophical discussion on another occasion.
I think as well it's important not to look at so much the specifics, but again look at why the fact that he came down and made himself human is enough to show that his love for us was so big that he didn't have to. If you were God right now, would you bring yourself down and make yourself flesh that you didn't have to become, and get put on a cross and get humiliated and get whipped and it was terrible what they did to him. He did it for us. He fasted for us out of love, so much love. If you have a child now and it's choking, you're going to drive through every red light to get it to the hospital. Doesn't matter how you get it to the hospital, you're going to get it there. Doesn't matter if the police stop you, whatever. You're going to keep going because that's an expression of your love to save your child. It's the exact same thing what he did for us, except on a much larger scale. So I don't think we should get caught up in the specifics, just to understand that whatever he did, everything that he did was out of so much love to save us. And the way we can show it back to him is by doing these small little things.
Awesome. I think we'll wrap it up there, and we'll stuff our face with some pizza. So yeah, all this talk of fasting, I'm sure we're hungry now. Can we give a round of applause for Father, please? So we'll be back next Tuesday. These talks are every Tuesday night. If you're new here, it's every Tuesday night, 7:30 p.m. We'll have food. We'll have vegan food now.